Hollywood was buzzing with an intensity that felt more like an earthquake than a simple piece of celebrity news, because the announcement that Taylor Swift was engaged should have been a moment of pure celebration, a glittering jewel in the crown of her career and personal life, but instead it tore open wounds that no one even realized existed, leaving fans, journalists, and even insiders completely stunned as they discovered that Blake Lively, once Taylor's closest confidant, the actress whose children Taylor had immortalized in her songs, the woman who had been seated at her table during award shows and photographed by her side at countless events, had been excluded, shut out, deliberately left off the guest list for one of the most important moments in the pop icon's life, and the implications of that decision were so heavy, so loaded with meaning, that Hollywood couldn't stop talking, analyzing, and speculating about what it all meant, because friendships in this town are not just friendships, they are alliances, symbols of power, and Blake's absence spoke volumes, not only about her personal standing with Taylor, but also about shifting dynamics in the entertainment hierarchy, and the story unfolded like a perfectly scripted drama, though no screenwriter could have captured the sheer rawness of the emotions behind the scenes, because Blake, who had always believed herself to be one of Taylor's most trusted inner circle members, was blindsided, caught completely off guard, her shock quickly hardening into a simmering fury as she scrolled through Instagram stories filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and inside jokes that she was no longer part of, each glittering snapshot serving as both a reminder of her exclusion and an unspoken declaration that the bond she thought unbreakable had been shattered. And while fans debated possible reasons, jealousy, rivalry, betrayal, the truth, insiders whispered, was far more complicated, tangled in years of shared experiences, moments of tension brushed under the rug, and unspoken resentments that had been growing quietly until they finally exploded in the most public way imaginable. And as the world tried to piece together what had gone wrong, Blake retreated, confiding to those closest to her that she felt betrayed, humiliated, and used, especially because she had defended Taylor through so many of her public battles, standing by her when the world mocked her for her dating life, celebrating her wins, and offering her home as a safe haven away from the cameras, only to now be discarded without so much as a warning. And the irony wasn't lost on anyone that Blake, who had built her Hollywood image around control, grace, and perfection, was suddenly caught in a scandal she couldn't manage. A story spiraling out of her hands as tabloids painted her as the scorned friend left behind. And while Taylor's camp said nothing, offering no explanation, no denial, no acknowledgement of the brewing firestorm, the silence itself became a statement, an icy confirmation that this was no accident, no scheduling oversight, but a calculated move, and that realization cut Blake deeper than any headline could, because in Hollywood the cruelest wound isn't criticism, it's indifference, the deliberate choice to erase someone from your narrative, and the betrayal festered as she replayed every moment of their friendship in her mind, wondering when things had shifted, if it had been something she said, or perhaps something she didn't say, if the warmth she thought she felt had only been a performance, a stage-managed friendship for the cameras that Taylor no longer found useful. And though friends urged her to stay quiet, to let the storm pass, Blake's anger burned too fiercely, and the industry insiders who thrive on whispers began leaking their own versions of the story, claiming that tensions had been rising for months, that Taylor had begun to view Blake as more of a rival than a friend, that private arguments about loyalty, image, and trust had become impossible to ignore. And while no one could confirm the exact reason for the split, everyone agreed on one thing. This was no small rift, this was a rupture, a break so deep it could never be repaired, and Hollywood, with its endless appetite for drama, was eating it up, dissecting every post, every paparazzi sighting, every carefully worded comment for clues, while Blake faced the impossible task of pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't, smiling for the cameras on red carpets even as she seethed inside, trying to maintain her image as Hollywood's golden actress while the tabloids painted her as a woman scorned, a friend discarded, a star out of favor with one of the most powerful women in entertainment. And the more she tried to hide her emotions, the more the press dug in, because nothing sells like the image of perfection cracking. And soon Blake realized that silence was no longer an option, because in Hollywood, if you don't tell your story, someone else will. And that was the moment when what had begun as a personal betrayal transformed into a full-scale public drama, a saga of loyalty, power, and revenge that blurred the line between friendship and strategy, exposing the fragility of even the most glamorous alliances under the unforgiving spotlight of fame. Yet even as Blake struggled to regain her composure and calculate her next move, the whispers around Hollywood only grew louder, mutating into rumors that spread like wildfire through every cocktail party and production set. Each insider adding their own spin, some claiming that Taylor had been hurt by something Blake said about her relationship in private circles, others suggesting that Taylor, always sensitive to loyalty, had felt betrayed when Blake was spotted mingling too warmly with individuals Taylor had long considered adversaries. And while no one could pinpoint the exact fracture, the mere fact that everyone was talking about it ensured that the narrative was no longer in Blake's hands, and she felt the walls of image control she had built so carefully over the years begin to crumble, because for someone like Blake, public perception was not just background noise, it was currency, the very foundation of her brand, and to see it unravel because of a silent exclusion was infuriating, fueling her determination to quietly but strategically remind the world of her own power. Yet Taylor's influence loomed too large to ignore, for every tabloid headline leaned in her favor, painting her as the untouchable queen who had curated a guest list of trust and intimacy, while Blake's absence was interpreted as proof that she had been exiled, punished, diminished, and the sheer humiliation of it weighed on her like a second skin. Because this wasn't just about missing a party, it was about being cut off from one of the most powerful cultural networks in the world. A network Blake had counted on to keep her at the center of Hollywood relevance. And so the actress, in quiet moments away from Ryan and her children, began replaying not just the last few months, but the entire timeline of their friendship, from the early days when she and Taylor had bonded over shared experiences of being underestimated in Hollywood, to the laughter-filled evenings when their friendship seemed unshakable, to the subtle shifts she had ignored when Taylor's inner circle began rotating, when certain friends were invited more often, when the tone of Taylor's texts grew cooler, and now, with the brutal clarity of hindsight, Blake realized the signs had been there all along. And that realization cut deeper than the exclusion itself, because it meant that she had been blind, too trusting, too invested in something that had perhaps always been conditional. And the sting of that truth only fueled her rage, while outside, the media began crafting its own mythology, tabloids running cover stories with side-by-side photos of the two women, one smiling in glittering rings and champagne, the other caught candidly in a moment of distraction, the caption screaming about betrayal and heartbreak, and social media amplified it all, fans turning into amateur detectives, combing through lyrics, interviews, and old social media posts for clues, creating viral threads that framed Blake as either the tragic heroine or the villain. And the polarization only deepened the scandal's hold on the public imagination, because nothing captivates like the fall of a golden friendship. And for Taylor, whether intentional or not, the silence only magnified her control, her refusal to address the situation becoming its own form of dominance, a message that she owed no one an explanation, least of all Blake, who meanwhile was beginning to sense that if she didn't reclaim her voice soon, the narrative would swallow her whole. But reclaiming her voice meant risk, because in Hollywood, the first one to break silence often pays the highest price. And as Blake weighed her options, she found herself cornered in a way she had never been before, forced to choose between maintaining the illusion of grace and perfection, or exposing the raw truth of her heartbreak and fury. And whichever path she chose, she knew the world was watching, waiting, eager to turn her pain into entertainment. Because in the end, that's what Hollywood does best. Transform real wounds into public spectacle. And as the cameras kept rolling, as the headlines grew more merciless, Blake realized that her feud with Taylor was no longer just a private matter, but a saga that had taken on a life of its own. A saga she could no longer control but only survive, and the survival itself would require cunning, strength, and perhaps the kind of ruthless reinvention she had never dared attempt before. Blake tried to steel herself against the tidal wave of speculation. The harder it became to ignore the brutal truth that every whisper, every headline, every dissected photograph was chipping away at the persona she had spent years cultivating. The image of the flawless Hollywood golden girl with the enviable marriage, the perfect career, and the most coveted friendships, because suddenly that perfection looked fragile, even performative, and the cruel underbelly of celebrity culture was that once the illusion cracked, people rushed to see how far the fall would go. And Blake knew this. She had watched others suffer the same fate, had even once privately discussed with Taylor how quickly admiration could turn to mockery. But she never imagined she would be the subject of that very cycle. And it enraged her to see that Taylor, who had once sworn loyalty and affection, was now the architect of her humiliation. For what was more cutting than exclusion? What was more brutal than silence? And as paparazzi camped outside her home, as fans demanded explanations, Blake's fury hardened into resolve. Because if Taylor thought she could erase her with one carefully orchestrated snub, she was mistaken. And so behind closed doors, Blake began quietly strategizing, reaching out to allies, planting whispers of her own, testing how the media would respond to counter-narratives, because in Hollywood the truth mattered less than perception, and perception could be molded, manipulated, reframed, and though her heart ached with betrayal, her mind was already working to ensure she would not be the casualty in Taylor's story, but the survivor who rewrote the ending. Yet every move she considered carried risks, for Taylor's influence was vast, her fanbase rabid, her reach unparalleled. And to cross her meant inviting not only industry backlash, but also the wrath of millions who saw Taylor as untouchable, and Blake, calculating as ever, understood that if she was to fight back it could not. In Hollywood had prepared for a storm that brewed quietly in private dinners and whispered conversations before crashing into the public eye with all the subtlety of a lightning strike. And at the very heart of this storm was Blake Lively, a woman once known for her golden charm, effortless poise, and carefully curated friendships that made her appear untouchable. Yet now she was being portrayed as the bitter outcast, the friend who had been abandoned in the spotlight, the symbol of collateral damage in Taylor Swift's dazzling engagement fairy tale. And though outsiders saw her as furious, jealous, and humiliated, the truth behind those glittering doors of Beverly Hills mansions and New York penthouses was far more complex, far more layered. Because Blake's fury was not born merely from exclusion but from betrayal, from the cruel realization that in an industry where image was everything, she had been reduced from a confidant to a footnote, and it ate away at her like poison in the bloodstream, fueling sleepless nights and endless strategy sessions with Ryan Reynolds who, despite his sarcasm and bravado, understood that his wife's pain was real, her career's stability at stake, her dignity hanging by a thread. And together they decided that this battle was no longer about friendship but about survival, about reclaiming control of a narrative that threatened to crush them both. So while Taylor flaunted her engagement bliss with Travis Kelce, Blake was orchestrating her own quiet war, a war of optics, timing, whispers, and veiled strikes that would unfold like a Shakespearean drama across tabloids, television, and social media, where every photo, every quote, every cryptic post would be dissected and weaponized. And though she never admitted it out loud, Blake relished the challenge, for underneath the wounded friend was the calculating strategist who knew that if she could withstand this storm, she wouldn't just survive, she would emerge more powerful than ever. And that very thought became the fuel that carried her into the next chapter of the feud that Hollywood could not look away from. Subscribe my channel Corevanta for more videos.